During the chaotic years of the World War II, when the Nazi war machine spread like a storm of fire across Europe, military history recorded many resounding names. Yet among those figures, there was a general who stood at the peak of power but seemed deliberately forgotten by time. That man was Walther von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, a field marshal who carried on his shoulders the responsibility of directing one of the most powerful and battle-hardened forces in the world at that time. In name, he held supreme command over the entire army. In reality, however, the situation was far harsher. He was rarely mentioned as the one who truly held power, and instead lived constantly in the enormous shadow of Adolf Hitler. This created a profound paradox. It led to a haunting question. Was Brauchitsch a talented general, restrained by authoritarian power, or was he simply a spineless arm controlled within the machinery of the Nazi regime? The answer is not easy. Behind the appearance of an outstanding professional officer, Brauchitsch carried a core tragedy. He possessed enormous authority in name but lacked real decision-making power entirely. This was not only the story of one individual, it was also the tragedy of an entire system where nominal power and actual power were painfully separated. And from that very paradox, his troubled journey began to unfold. To understand why Walther von Brauchitsch became the man he was, we must go back to his origins. We must return to the early years that most deeply shaped his character and way of thinking. He was born into a long-established military aristocratic family in Berlin. His father was a Prussian cavalry general belonging to the professional officer class that had dominated both the German army and the state apparatus for generations. With such a noble background, Brauchitsch's military path was almost predetermined from the cradle. It was a path of absolute service, iron discipline, and unwavering loyalty to superiors and to the fatherland. From childhood, he was raised and educated in one of the most elite environments in Berlin. He studied at the prestigious Französisches Gymnasium, Berlin. He then entered the cadet academy at Gross Lichterfelde, where generations of Prussia's finest officers were trained. His education did not stop at academic knowledge. Brauchitsch was also selected to serve as an aide to Augusta Victoria. Through this experience, he developed a calm demeanor, refined manners, and genuine aristocratic bearing. These qualities would remain with him throughout his life. Coming from the Prussian Junker class, Brauchitsch carried the traditional spirit of this social group, Pflicht, the sacred sense of duty, and Gehorsam, absolute obedience. This value system had been forged over hundreds of years, where personal honor always stood behind duty to the army and the state. A Junker did not only learn how to fight, he also learned how to sacrifice himself for a larger system, for an order regarded as sacred. This education and family tradition engraved deeply within Brauchitsch, the model of a typical Prussian officer. He was strict with himself, unconditionally loyal, and always valued discipline above personal individuality. These qualities later helped him rise to high positions in the army. Yet, they also became invisible bonds that restrained him in the face of great historical upheavals. From this point, we can see clearly that Brauchitsch was not a random product of his era. He was the embodiment of a long-standing military tradition, a tradition that created the strength of Germany, but also unintentionally prepared him for tragedy when he confronted a completely different kind of power. However, what shaped Walther von Brauchitsch most deeply was not his noble blood or outward bearing, but the military mindset he developed from his earliest years. Brauchitsch came from the artillery branch. After graduating in 1900, he quickly joined the army and entered the German General Staff, the intellectual center, and the brain of the entire Prussian military. There he was trained in a very distinctive approach. Everything had to rely on precise calculation, on clear coordinates, and on meticulous preparation down to the smallest detail. His thinking favored order control and certainty, rather than risk or personal intuition. At the same time, Brauchitsch absorbed a core principle of the Prussian military tradition. The army must remain completely apolitical. In Prussian officer culture, a good soldier was one who executed the technical art of war as perfectly as possible. He was not expected to question the political purpose behind orders, nor to interfere in matters considered the domain of the state and its leaders. The army was viewed as a pure instrument, a machine operating through discipline and expertise, entirely separated from political turbulence. This combination of precise and cautious artillery thinking, together with the apolitical principle, created a Brauchitsch typical of the old era. He believed in the system. He believed in established order, and he believed that absolute loyalty to superiors formed the foundation of all military virtues. Yet these very qualities later became sharply opposed to the leadership style of Adolf Hitler. While Brauchitsch sought careful calculation and tight control, Hitler favored bold and risky decisions, often based on personal intuition and sudden speed. The collision between these two mindsets was not merely a personal difference. It was a conflict between a long-standing military tradition and an entirely new way of warfare, unpredictable and dangerous. From this point, we can recognize something important. What had once been Brauchitsch's strength unintentionally became his limitation when history entered a new and turbulent chapter. When the World War I broke out, Walther von Brauchitsch carried this very mindset into the reality of the battlefield. He was not a general leading bold assaults at the front line. Instead, he mainly served as a staff officer on the Western Front. It was the position of a man who thought, planned, and coordinated from the rear, rather than one who directly commanded the spearhead of attack. There, he took part in planning several major operations, most notably the brutal war of attrition at Battle of Verdun. The experience he gained did not come from daring moves or sudden inspiration. It came from extreme precision, from detailed calculation, and from maintaining strict discipline within the command structure. Every decision was carefully weighed. Every movement of the army aimed to ensure order and maximum efficiency. When the war ended, Brauchitsch held the rank of major, along with prestigious decorations, such as the Iron Cross First Class and the House Order of Hohenzollern. These honors not only recognized his contributions, but also confirmed him as an outstanding staff officer of the Prussian army. More importantly, through those 4 years of fire and smoke, Brauchitsch fully absorbed the military mindset of his era. The system mattered more than the individual. Order had to stand above creativity. He embodied the ideal of a Generalstabsoffizier, a talented Prussian staff officer, a quiet mind behind the battlefield, rather than a heroic Feldherr leading armies from the front. This solid foundation helped him remain steady throughout his later career. Yet this same perspective, valuing stability and adherence to the system above all else, unintentionally laid the first stone of his later tragedy. When history entered a new chapter with entirely different demands, this precise and disciplined staff officer would face a harsh reality. At times, perfect obedience becomes the very chain that binds a man to his own fate. After the World War I ended in Germany's heavy defeat, another dark chapter opened for the entire Prussian military. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh conditions on Germany, including drastic reductions in its armed forces. The German army was allowed to maintain only 100,000 men, with the number of officers limited to 4,000. Thousands of soldiers and talented officers were forced to leave the service, many carrying deep frustration and despair. In that context, Walther von Brauchitsch belonged to the small group who were fortunate enough to remain. It was not luck, but his outstanding organizational ability and iron discipline demonstrated throughout the war that kept him in place. Under the reorganization led by Hans von Seeckt, the Reichswehr was rebuilt as an elite force. Only officers with stable character, high professional competence, and the ability to build systems were selected. Brauchitsch was one of those who best matched these strict standards. Throughout the 1920s, he held roles that were not glamorous, yet deeply foundational within the Ministry of Defense, particularly in the artillery department. He devoted himself to drawing lessons from the recent war, reforming artillery classification systems, and emphasizing close coordination between artillery and infantry. These improvements were not revolutionary, but they were extremely important. Quietly, they laid the groundwork for later mechanized operations, which the world would later recognize as blitzkrieg. During these years, Brauchitsch's advancement was steady and solid. There were no sudden leaps and no controversial decisions. From lieutenant colonel, he became a divisional chief of staff, then rose to colonel and major general. It was a typical path for a diligent and loyal officer, who always placed the interests of the system above all else. He was not a man who created new doctrines or breakthrough ideas like Heinz Guderian with armored forces or Erich von Manstein with bold operational plans. Instead, Brauchitsch was a builder of systems. He sharpened the tools. He ensured that the military machine, however restricted, operated as smoothly and efficiently as possible. In the shadow of the Treaty of Versailles, when Germany lived under constraint and humiliation, Brauchitsch quietly contributed to preserving and preparing future military strength. Yet this same stability and caution once again confirmed his limitation. He was born to perfect a system, not to change it. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began a massive rearmament of Germany, the career of Walther von Brauchitsch entered a new chapter, filled with subtle and complex challenges. He was assigned command of East Prussia, a strategically important region on the eastern border. The position carried military sensitivity and also required political skill. There, Brauchitsch once again demonstrated his steady and reliable leadership. He focused on strengthening forces, improving discipline, and enhancing combat readiness while trying to keep his distance from political matters. He did not openly oppose the new regime as long as the army gained strength and status. For him, this was the supreme objective of a Prussian officer. However, during this period of power transition, early signs of his later tragedy began to appear. In 1934, during the Bloody Purge, commonly known as the Night of the Long Knives, many political rivals and several former military figures were eliminated. Like most Prussian officers of the time, Brauchitsch chose silence. He believed that keeping the army outside political turmoil would preserve its independence and traditions. This belief had long been deeply rooted in Prussian officer culture. While commanding East Prussia, he also experienced certain tensions with the SS as they attempted to expand their influence into military affairs. Brauchitsch voiced objections to some efforts to replace the army's role in regional administration. He wanted to maintain a clear boundary between military and political spheres. Yet his objections remained limited. He always avoided direct confrontation and did not wish to challenge the emerging system. His silence and caution, though motivated by a desire to protect the army unintentionally, contributed to strengthening Hitler's absolute power. Each time he and many other officers chose not to speak, the boundary between army and state became slightly more blurred. What he believed to be wise neutrality gradually turned into a retreat from the apolitical tradition that the Prussian army once proudly upheld. From this point, Brauchitsch continued to rise thanks to his dedication and loyalty to the system. But within that silence, an invisible trap had already begun to close around him. It was a trap he had not yet recognized. After many years of steady and solid advancement, Walther von Brauchitsch reached the rank of General of Artillery in 1936. It was a position high enough to place him within the supreme command circle of the German army. Yet the truly decisive turning point came in 1938 through a crisis that shook the entire military establishment. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair deeply disrupted the foundations of traditional Prussian leadership. War Minister Werner von Blomberg was forced to resign because of a personal scandal, while Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Werner von Fritsch, was removed by controversial accusations. Behind these surface scandals lay a clear and cold objective of Adolf Hitler. He intended to purge the senior officer class, rooted in the Prussian tradition, so that he could take direct and absolute control of the military. In the power vacuum deliberately created, Brauchitsch was chosen as the successor. He was not the most outstanding candidate in terms of military brilliance, nor the one with the greatest prestige among generals. Hitler selected him for a deeper reason. Brauchitsch was the safest choice. His organizational ability was solid. His aristocratic background reassured the pride of the army, yet he was not strong or decisive enough to directly challenge rising political authority. In February 1938, Brauchitsch was officially appointed Commander-in-Chief of the German Army. In name, this was the pinnacle of the military career any Prussian officer could desire. Yet at the very moment he entered this position, a profound and meaningful change occurred. Hitler declared himself supreme commander of all armed forces. At the same time, he established the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht under Wilhelm Keitel, a structure designed to control and bypass the traditional command system of the army. From that point, although Brauchitsch carried the title of Commander-in-Chief of the army, his position became little more than a splendid golden cage. He could administer the army in name, but the real key to decision-making lay entirely in Hitler's hands. The supreme authority on paper turned out to be tightly limited from the very beginning. At what seemed to be his most glorious moment, the tragedy of Walther von Brauchitsch became clearer than ever. He stood at the peak in name, yet was gradually pushed away from the true center of power. The rise to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the army did not bring Walther von Brauchitsch the freedom and independence he had hoped for. On the contrary, soon after taking office, a deeply personal constraint appeared. Quiet but firm, it gradually tightened around him. At that time, Brauchitsch was facing a private crisis. He wanted to divorce his first wife and remarry, but encountered serious financial difficulties. In Prussian officer culture, honor was sacred. Revealing personal financial problems was highly sensitive. Adolf Hitler understood this well and intervened deliberately. He granted Brauchitsch a large sum of 80,000 Reichsmarks to settle the divorce. On the surface, the money looked like assistance. In reality, it became a dangerous bond. In the honor tradition of Prussian officers, accepting money from a superior for private matters was considered a grave humiliation. It touched personal dignity and created an invisible debt, almost impossible to repay. Brauchitsch accepted. In that moment, he not only solved a family problem, but also entered a deeper dependency than any military order could impose. This bond tightened further when his new wife, Charlotte Schmidt, proved to be a strong supporter of the Nazi regime. In private life, she brought him stability and calm. Politically, however, her presence drew Brauchitsch closer into Hitler's orbit of power. The boundary between personal life and official duty gradually blurred. From this point, the traditional honor of a Prussian officer began to give way to dependence. Each time Brauchitsch wished to object to a decision, an invisible barrier appeared. It was not only a barrier created by the power structure, but also one formed by his own conscience and the debt of gratitude he carried. His silence no longer stemmed solely from the principle of being apolitical. It was also shaped by personal ties that tightened more and more. Within this combination of nominal authority and personal constraints, Brauchitsch gradually became a commander-in-chief who could govern only on paper. In reality, he was increasingly pushed away from the center of decision-making. After accepting the financial favor and moving deeper into the orbit of Adolf Hitler, Walther von Brauchitsch gradually lost the distance he had once tried to maintain from politics. In 1939, after Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, he was awarded the Golden Party Badge. This was a clear sign that the boundary between an apolitical officer and a participant in the new regime had been crossed. From that point, he no longer stood outside the vortex of power. When the World War II officially began with the invasion of Poland, Brauchitsch held the title of Commander-in-Chief of the army. He supervised planning and coordination, but the most critical decisions remained in Hitler's hands. The campaign ended quickly, with a decisive victory. Yet the success came mainly from overwhelming strength and firepower, not from strategic breakthroughs proposed by him. A pattern was becoming clear. Brauchitsch carried responsibility in name, while Hitler held real authority. At the end of 1939, while preparing for the Western Offensive, Brauchitsch and Franz Halder quietly considered the possibility of overthrowing Hitler, fearing a disastrous defeat. They even prepared plans and discussed them seriously. However, when facing Hitler directly in the meeting of November 5th, Brauchitsch withdrew before the dictator's fury. Any opportunity for resistance, if it had existed, passed in uneasy silence. In 1940, as plans for the attack on France were developed, Brauchitsch's conservative thinking again became clear. Initially, he and Halder supported a modified version of the classical Schlieffen plan, a safer option, but one that risked prolonged attrition. They rejected the bold idea of Erich von Manstein, who proposed sending tanks through the dense Ardennes to cut behind Allied forces in a sweeping encirclement. Brauchitsch considered the Ardennes impassable for armoured units, and even attempted to remove Manstein from the command centre. Only when Manstein presented the plan directly to Hitler was it accepted, becoming the foundation for one of the most shocking victories in military history. France collapsed in 6 weeks, as Commander-in-Chief Brauchitsch was promoted to Field Marshal in July 1940 together with several other generals. It was the peak of his career, yet a paradoxical borrowed glory. The breakthrough idea belonged to Manstein. The final decision belonged to Hitler. Brauchitsch was merely the executor. He received the rank of Field Marshal for a plan he had once strongly opposed. The events at Dunkirk evacuation further highlighted his powerlessness. When British forces were trapped and victory seemed within reach, Hitler suddenly ordered a halt. Brauchitsch strongly objected but could not change the decision. Once again, the head of the army had to witness that real power lay beyond his reach. The successive victories in Poland and France brought glory to Germany, but also pushed Brauchitsch further from the center of authority. Each success strengthened Hitler's faith in personal intuition, while the role of the traditional general staff steadily shrank. The glory Brauchitsch received turned out to be only reflected light from decisions made by others. The lightning victories in Poland and France not only brought glory to Germany, but also revealed more clearly the nature of the relationship between Walther von Brauchitsch and Adolf Hitler. It was not cooperation between two centers of power. It was an unequal interaction between one man who made absolute decisions and another who was forced to adapt constantly. Brauchitsch did not always agree with Hitler. He was deeply concerned about the danger of Germany falling into a two-front war, a scenario that had led to disaster during the World War I. He also opposed Hitler's deep interference in low-level tactical decisions, which in Prussian military tradition belonged to commanders on the ground. At times when Hitler frequently compared himself to Napoleon Bonaparte, Brauchitsch was among the very few who dared to tell him directly that the age of self-made Napoleons had passed. However, these moments of frankness were rare and remained only words. They never turned into real action. Gradually, a familiar and troubling pattern emerged. Hitler issued orders. Brauchitsch expressed cautious concern or opposition. In the end, he still complied. The silence after each objection grew heavier, like an unspoken admission that real power no longer belonged to him. This helplessness also stemmed from deep psychological factors. With the elegant, calm and aristocratic style of a Prussian officer shaped over generations, Brauchitsch felt completely out of place before Hitler's rough, emotional and volatile personality. The pressure of these tense meetings affected not only his mind but also eroded his physical health. He often suffered heart pains and exhaustion, especially during periods of direct confrontation with the dictator. He differed sharply from Ludwig Beck, his predecessor, who resigned in 1938 to express open opposition to Hitler's war policy. Beck chose to leave the system when he recognized its limits. Brauchitsch, by contrast, decided to remain, believing he could reduce damage from within. He told himself he was serving the fatherland, not an individual. Yet reality became increasingly harsh. Every order he signed, every campaign he implemented, served Hitler's personal will. In a totalitarian regime, the boundary between loyalty to the nation and obedience to a leader becomes blurred. Brauchitsch, though intelligent and experienced, seemed not decisive enough to confront that reality. His elegance and aristocratic spirit, once a source of pride, became weaknesses before the raw and overwhelming force of political power. Within this tense and unequal relationship, Brauchitsch's tragedy became clearer. He was commander-in-chief of the army, yet he did not truly command the war in which his own army was fighting. In the summer of 1941, when Nazi Germany opened a new chapter filled with ambition and danger, the tragedy of Walther von Brauchitsch entered an irreversible stage. The Operation Barbarossa was launched, a massive offensive intended to destroy the Soviet Union in a short time. Brauchitsch still stood as commander-in-chief of the army, taking part in planning and coordinating forces. Yet once again, real control did not belong to him. It lay entirely in the hands of Adolf Hitler. From the beginning, the campaign carried serious systemic mistakes. The German leadership, including Brauchitsch and the general staff, underestimated Soviet strength. They believed that one powerful blow would collapse the entire structure, just as France had fallen the year before. They ignored the enormous scale of territory, population, and total war mobilization capacity. German forces were divided into 3 main directions: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev, with the Ukrainian region in the south. This was not purely a military choice. It was heavily influenced by economic and political factors. Many generals, including Brauchitsch, leaned toward concentrating on Moscow. Hitler prioritized other objectives. As a result, armored forces were moved back and forth between fronts, wasting precious time and fuel, especially as winter approached. Brauchitsch, trained as an artillery officer focused on logistics and precise calculation, must have recognized these risks. Yet the confidence of the Prussian aristocratic tradition overshadowed strict military logic. No serious contingency plan was prepared for a prolonged war of attrition or for the severe cold of the Russian winter. Pressure on Brauchitsch grew beyond endurance. Hitler interfered deeply in battlefield details, issuing rigid orders. No retreat. Hold positions at all costs. Political objectives overrode military reality. Flexibility, once a key strength of the German army, gradually disappeared. This was completely contrary to the military thinking Brauchitsch had learned throughout his life. The field marshal at the head of the army had become merely a supervisor of orders rather than a decision-maker. The irony reached its peak when Hitler began personally moving small units on maps, bypassing the professional staff system entirely. The accumulated strain finally exceeded human limits. In November 1941, Brauchitsch suffered a severe heart attack. It was not only a physical crisis, but also a psychological breaking point for a man trapped between duty and harsh reality. Only 1 month later, on December 6, 1941, the Soviet Red Army launched a large-scale counteroffensive and pushed German forces back from the gates of Moscow. It was the first major defeat of Nazi Germany in the war and a decisive turning point. The strategy of rapid victory halted before the vast snow-covered fields of Russia. At that moment, the boneless arm finally broke. Brauchitsch, who once stood at the nominal peak of the German army, now faced a harsh truth. He no longer had the health and no longer had the power to change anything. After the defeat at the gates of Moscow, events unfolded quickly and coldly. On December 19, 1941, Walther von Brauchitsch was officially dismissed as Commander-in-Chief of the army by Adolf Hitler. There was no farewell ceremony, no words of thanks, and no public debate or explanation. It was simply a decision imposed from above, concise and merciless. Immediately afterward, Hitler assumed direct command of the army himself, a step without precedent in German military history. This act marked the complete end of the professional Prussian staff system, a system that had existed for generations and had shaped Germany's military strength. From that point on, the army no longer operated according to pure military logic. It was placed entirely under the personal will of a single leader. For Brauchitsch, this was the end of a military career that had lasted decades. He was not publicly executed, nor purged in blood like many others. Instead, he was transferred to the Führer Reserve, a quiet but effective form of removal typical of the Nazi regime. This was how the system handled figures who had once held high positions but were no longer useful, or who had lost the confidence of the supreme leadership without creating noise or open conflict. From then on, Brauchitsch lived in complete isolation. He never met Hitler again, and he never returned to any position of power. The man who had once led the most powerful land army in Europe became only a fading name pushed to the margins of history. This ending carried a silent yet profound humiliation. Brauchitsch was not the victim of an ordinary military defeat. He was the victim of the obedience he had chosen. He had sacrificed much from the honor of a Prussian officer to the independence of the army in order to remain loyal to the system. Yet that very loyalty made him expendable in the eyes of the man he had served. It was a bitter conclusion not marked by gunfire or public condemnation, but by the cold silence of power. A man who once stood at the summit was finally removed quietly, as if he had never existed within the vast machine to which he had devoted his entire life. After his dismissal, Walther von Brauchitsch almost completely disappeared from the center of power of the Third Reich. He withdrew to live quietly on an estate in Poland, far removed from all military and political activity. During the remaining years of the war, he did not take part in any resistance effort against Adolf Hitler, including the July 20 plot, when many other officers risked their lives to change the course of history. Brauchitsch chose the path of silence. He was fully aware of the growing dissatisfaction within the army, yet he maintained a neutral stance. After the plot failed, he continued to display loyalty as a way to preserve himself. This was no longer the honor of a noble Prussian officer. It was merely the instinct of survival paid for with absolute silence. More deeply, this choice reflected a profound tragedy, the tragedy of an oath. Throughout his life, Brauchitsch clung to his oath of loyalty to the head of state as an unchangeable principle. He did not realize, or did not dare to face, that when such an oath served a criminal regime, keeping it also meant enabling inhuman acts. In 1945, when the Third Reich collapsed, Brauchitsch was captured by British forces. Unlike Wilhelm Keitel or Alfred Jodl, he did not become one of the central figures at the Nuremberg trials. He appeared only as a witness, attempting to defend the honor of the General Staff by placing primary responsibility on Hitler and the SS. Accusations of war crimes, especially related to Poland and the Soviet Union, were prepared against him, but in the end, a separate trial never took place. On October 18, 1948, Walther von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia and heart failure in a military hospital in Hamburg while still in custody. His death was extremely quiet, just like the final years of his life. There was no final defense before a court of humanity. There was no public moment of confronting the consequences of the war he had once helped command. He departed, carrying silence about what he had known and what he had not dared to do. That death closed a life full of paradox. A man who once held enormous nominal power ended in isolation and obscurity. History did not reserve harsh judgments for him like those directed at other architects. Instead, it left a vast and controversial void, the void of banality within evil. The story of Walther von Brauchitsch does not end with a glorious victory or a dramatic defeat, but with a quiet and troubling tragedy. He was not an outstanding military genius, nor the most brutal symbol of the regime. He was a typical example of what many thinkers later called the banality of evil, a man intelligent enough to recognize what was wrong, yet lacking the resolve to refuse it. Despite possessing strong organizational ability, rich experience, and many opportunities to exert influence, Brauchitsch lacked the most essential quality: political courage and personal moral strength. He embodied the traditional Prussian officer, absolutely loyal to the system, strictly obedient to orders, and distant from politics. In a normal state, these qualities would have formed a solid foundation for career and honor. But under a totalitarian regime, those same virtues became fatal weaknesses. In such a context, inaction itself becomes a choice, and sometimes the choice with the heaviest consequences. Brauchitsch held supreme authority over the German army, yet it was only a sword without a blade. He stood at the head of one of the most elite armies in the world, able to command millions of soldiers, yet he could not utter the simplest word, no. His tragedy lay not only in his helplessness before Adolf Hitler, but also in his responsibility toward the soldiers under his command. As commander-in-chief, he had a duty to protect them not only from external enemies but also from mistaken orders from above. Yet, when he chose silence, he effectively allowed them to march into the fields of Poland, the muddy roads of Russia, and death in the harsh winter before Moscow. History does not ask what he did. It asks what he failed to do when he had the ability to act differently. He foresaw the danger of a two-front war. He understood the strategic mistakes. He recognized the risk of concentrating all power in a single individual. Yet he chose to remain within the system, remain within nominal authority, and remain in silence. Unlike Ludwig Beck, who resigned in protest, and unlike officers who later risked their lives to oppose the regime, Brauchitsch chose the easier path: obedience. That choice shaped his legacy. He was not a fanatic, not a tyrant, and not a hero. He was a man in between, intelligent enough to understand, but not courageous enough to act. He represented the many who believed that by simply doing their job well, the storm would pass. History proved otherwise. Sometimes the world does not collapse because of the most brutal individuals, but because those with power and responsibility choose silence and obedience. The story of Walther von Brauchitsch leaves a profound warning. Power without courage is only a golden cage for a bound soul. He obtained the field marshal's baton, high rank and temporary glory, yet, He lost the most precious thing for a soldier, the independence of conscience. And that is the greatest legacy he left to future generations, a painful reminder of the price paid when a person does not dare to say no,